finds himself united with a second figure, which is that of Laws, which is one of Blake's creations, often referred to as the kind of alter ego or representative of the poet in the work. And Laws is a kind of prophetic blacksmith who is the agent of eternity, in a sense, in time. And Blake has this remarkable experience of also being made one with Laws just after he's been subject to this reincarnation of Milton. And he's got this quite visceral experience of Laws standing behind him as this terrible flaming sun, but ultimately receives a kind of blessing from Laws. He kissed me and wished me health, and I became one man with him, arising in my strength. So we have Blake here kind of united both with Milton and with Laws. And in Northrop Frye's paraphrase of this event, this experience, we see how these two things come together, and the way Frye phrases it, we get a sense here that something that we might call kairos is at stake. There is some kind of interweaving here of the eternal with the temporal. It's what happens next, and the way it happens in the actual fabric of the text that really interests me, and usually really kind of blows my mind. So the experience that I've just referred to of Blake joining with Laws, we can see towards the top of the page here in what's the second paragraph. I don't know how clear it is, but I'll read some of it out. So Blake is giving an account of this in the first person, his union with Milton and then his union with Laws. And we see it towards the end of the second paragraph there. I became one man with him, arising in my strength. It was too late now to recede. Laws had entered into my soul. His terrors now possessed me whole. I arose in fury and strength. And then in the third paragraph, Blake continues, at least so it appears, in the first person, and speaks, I am that shadowy prophet who 6,000 years ago fell from my station in the eternal bosom. 6,000 years are finished, I return. Both time and space obey my will. Which is a staggering kind of proclamation if this is coming out of the mouth of Blake himself. And it's really astounding. And it's one of those kind of vertiginous moments where you're not quite sure what happens. But the fact that it's in the present tense and in the first person has a remarkable force, I think, and leads us to some of these themes that I want to pick up on. It's only at the end of that paragraph that Blake, or the poet, the text reads, so spake or spoke Laws as we went along to his supreme abode. There's a kind of, in hindsight, this seems to be attributed to Laws, but of course they've already become one. And in the way the text reads, we hear them as one and we see them really as one. And it's quite clear that Blake has now kind of taken upon himself to be able to speak in this way. So here we have some of the key themes that I wanted to draw out in just a minute. Blake clearly has some interesting conceptions here to do with the nature of inspiration and tradition. And there's also this idea of kairos and what I will call or refer to as kerygma in a second or in a minute. It actually so happens the nature of Blake's book is not entirely linear and narrative and so on. And we actually get kind of two versions of this same or similar experience. And here's a really lovely plate where we can see Blake in his garden on the south coast of England. First of all, being approached by the kind of the announcing, visiting figure of someone called Olo Lorne, who announces the imminent descent of Milton. So Blake kind of gives an account of this experience as happening in his garden. Milton enters Blake, and then Milton proceeds to give what is, I think, one of the most extraordinary extended speeches in all of Blake's work, where Milton himself, but again, speaking in the first person, which allows us to also hear this as the kind of vision and mission of Blake himself. Milton declares, I come in self-annihilation and the grandeur of inspiration, to cast off rational demonstration by faith in the Saviour, to cast off the rotten rags of memory by inspiration, to cast off Bacon, Locke, and Newton from Albion's covering. Again, this is first person present tense. And it has the effect, I feel, reading this, and I'll suggest that this fits into one of our themes, that this happens as we hear it, in a sense. This is enacted. This is not just a kind of characterization of something that may or may not happen. This is not description. This is not fictional. It's not referring to something that's happened somewhere else. This is happening. This is action in progress, as it were. So let's pay some attention to some of these themes. The idea of calling clearly is pervasive in Blake. We hear a lot about it. It's there at the beginning of Jerusalem. His next kind of final, most finished illuminated book. He's got interesting things to say about calling. He often speaks of kind of direct inspiration, of almost taking dictation and so on. Clearly feels himself to have been tasked with something quite tremendous. I think what's also interesting to note is that the nature of this calling or this inspiration takes the form both of him being kind of divinely inspired as he sees it, or he has this union with the figure of Laws, embodying something like the divine inspiration on the one hand, and on the other hand, at the same time, this engages Blake directly with the literary tradition embodied by Milton. So there's a twofold nature of the calling here, I think. And Northrop Frye makes an interesting distinction, which I thought I'd just flag up, and I think he's onto something, and it might be something that is fruitful for other conversations this week. He makes a distinction between a Hellenic or classical conception of tradition and a Hebraic one, and he thinks that Blake kind of strongly urges a Hebraic understanding of tradition, and that Blake himself can be seen and sees himself as inhabiting a Hebraic kind of tradition. And the point of this, on this conception, this is not a matter of kind of preserving, adding to, and passing on a historical kind of cumulative body of knowledge, but rather this entails the reception, the possession, the embodiment of one kind of single, holistic, eternal vision. It entails kind of shouldering the burden of this vision, of this tradition, while also trying to clarify it, purging it of some of the mistakes or errors of its previous prophets, previous custodians. And this is what Blake takes himself to be doing with Milton, trying to reveal what Milton tried to reveal in some sense, but tweaking it, to use a kind word, to try and purge some of what Blake perceives to be Milton's mistakes, poetic and theological. The theme of kairos, or the theme of kind of significant time or spiritual time, is everywhere in Blake, and I think some of his most famous lines, to see the world in a grain of sand and so on, all pertain to this sense that he thinks we can and should apprehend the eternal somehow within the fabric of time, and allow that to transfigure the fabric of time. The agent for him, the agent doing this for Blake, is Laws, this prophet, this blacksmith figure, who is representative of the poet and of the poet's role. And Frye calls him the imaginative form of time, the spiritual form of time. And Laws kind of embodies our condition as being kind of torn between chronos, clock time on the one hand, and kairos, kind of spiritual time on the other, and embodies the labor with which we try to kind of belong more to kairos and make kairos manifest, and not fall into the kind of entropy that characterizes mere clock time, mere temporal existence. And I think here, I'm just going to flag this up. I don't want to talk about it now because it will take time, but there are lots of fruitful discussions to be had here, I think, between Blake and some of the modernists, notably Eliot and the Four Quartets, who shares, I think, the same concern, same obsession with this intersection of the timeless with time. I think there are interesting things to say in conversation between Blake and David Jones. And I think probably Odysseus Elitis, the Axion Esti, which is obviously not part of the kind of English canon in that sense, I think comes closer than anything else I've encountered to a kind of Blakean sense, I think, of time and vocation. And I'll try to write something about that when this becomes a written paper. But I think that there are conversations to be had there between Blake and modernists, certainly. The more distinctive concept, the more distinctive thing I want to tease out is this idea of kerygma, which I think which obviously the word can refer to both the content and the manner of Christ's kind of proclamations in the New Testament, but also in, or at least has a close analogy or has its parallel within linguistics and philosophy of language in what Austin and others have called kind of performative speech acts. And a couple of critics of Blake have pointed out that this is really distinctive. This is really key to understanding what Blake is doing and to reading his work. And a performative speech act would be something like, I promise, I now sentence you to, I now baptize you, I now declare you man and wife, and so on. The key word is now, and what happens here is that that which is spoken comes to be, in a sense. Right? The words affect what they claim, what they declare. The utterances bring a new state of affairs into being. And the paradigmatic one of the paradigmatic examples from the New Testament is Jesus saying, "Today this scripture is fulfilled," and it is fulfilled as he says it, in the very act of saying. And Blake plays with these sort of tropes or these announcements time and time again, and we saw that in the excerpts we've looked at. We see it in previous work of his, and we see it in the later work of Jerusalem. And what's interesting about this, I think, is that it implicates us, because there are questions to be asked about what gives these utterances authority, and what kind of contexts need to be in play for these announcements actually come into effect. The way I declare you man and wife comes into effect. What's the context in which that actually works? And one aspect of it certainly is that we have to be imaginatively receptive to it. And this happens time and time again in Blake's work, is that we're kind of invited to be part of the action, in a sense. And whatever he declares is meant to happen in and through us, in a sense. As Laws here enters the grave, or enters the world of the poem, we enter it with him, and so on. And time again, his labors are kind of depicted as being ours, in a sense, and we're meant to identify with this. On the matter of the theme of kerygma and kairos, again, interesting conversations to be had with theology, and I just want to flag these up as suggestive points of departure as well. I don't want to spend time on it now, but I came across two relatively recent papers that I think can hold up a great deal of conversation with Blake. One by Joseph Ratzinger here, where there are certainly points of contact with Blake, also some points of contention. I think Blake would certainly be accused by Ratzinger of being over hasty, the word he uses there. But Blake has a stronger emphasis on the kind of now than on the not quite yet, in terms of our experience of eternity. A second paper that I think is perhaps more congenial to Blake's vision of tradition and of kerygma is by Callistus Ware, that picks up on, I think, some of the very same key themes that Blake is playing with in this account of his own calling. Right. So my final issue that I want to raise then is the kind of practical question of, well, how on earth should a poet try to achieve this in practice? Laws is an interesting figure, because Laws kind of is beating time, in a sense. Laws embodies time, and he's a blacksmith. And I think it can't be the case, it clearly isn't the case for Blake, that he thinks that making kind of declarative statements is enough to kind of bring about the new reality that he envisions. Somehow he has to, as a poet, realize his vision successfully, poetically. And if it comes to manipulating time, if what he's hoping to do is to make moments of eternal significance or a vision of eternity present in time, as a poet, the way you manipulate time is most concretely through meter. So there is a real practical decision to be made on how to try to render this and make it possible. And Blake has reservations about the kind of meters that were traditionally available to him for various reasons, some poetic reasons, some kind of political, religious reasons. He did not want to do what the Augustines did with Pope and Dryden, did not want to do what Milton had done either. And there is Blake points to, I think, a reasonable concern when it comes to meter, the tension in meter itself, whether it kind of belongs to something that's a bit too mechanical, too metronymic, too mathematical, and therefore perhaps belongs more to something like clock time, than there's perhaps a more organic, living measure that might be more suitable to embodying kairos in a sense. Blake has some interesting concerns there, but clearly, given the the vision that he has and the themes that he's playing with, some kind of measure is essential, some definite form is essential to realize the poetic work, and to, as it were, defeat and subdue the spectre of abstraction, of formlessness, of chaos, of entropy, which is really what Blake's work is very, very much about, giving definite particular form to things so that we can have a vision and an experience in the first place of the eternal. And it's interesting, therefore, that he seems to settle in the end for he chooses a meter. He chooses a kind of septenarius, a kind of 7 foot, a 14er in the old sense, but he uses it rather loosely, and it's best perceived, people have argued, as a line of 7 beats rather than 7 feet. And this seems entirely appropriate given the figure of Laws as the blacksmith, whose job within the poem is, as it were, to make time itself the pulsating arteries, the new life of this reawakening figure of Albion, within which all of Blake's action happens. Blake's work is about reawakening the collective man that is Albion. And Laws is the agent of that, the imaginative agent of trying to revive Albion. And it seems appropriate that Blake therefore chooses a kind of beat-based measure to try and achieve this concretely in practice. And there are questions to be had about how successful that is, but I think he does to a great extent at least succeed, and it seems an appropriate way to try to do it. And again, just to finish off, what's striking about Blake, I think what's always so inspiring about him, but he does actually extend the call to us. He wants us to be somehow part of the same labor. Laws's work to revive Albion is Blake's work, and it's also ours in a sense. We're meant to be imaginative participants in this whole project. So the call is kind of passed on to us. And I'll end there. That's hopefully roughly that's probably enough time. I'll leave my details there. We'll have a conversation later. Thank you very much. I'll stop share.
All right. Thank you, Daniel. That was fascinating. I look forward to discussing it further. So my paper is a bit more formal. I'll try not to make it too dry. I am going to put in the chat a link to a handout that goes along with. Can you all see that in the chat? Yeah, you might find it helpful to have open just to see some of the passages I talk about. I decided not to use slides. The fewer different things I have to do technologically, the better. But this paper, Silence and Invocation in Coleridge and Shelley, is part of a book project called Poetry at the Edge of Silence, in which I explore the paradoxical relationship between poetry and the ineffable. While this phenomenon is evident throughout the history of poetry, at least in English, the tradition I know best, I concentrate on the period from 1700 to 1830. Beginning in the mid-18th century, there's a turn inward toward contemplation, which, as conventional wisdom has it, paves the way for the romantic focus on the self and the individual voice. However, insofar as these poets situate themselves in relation to a divine or natural other, the poet's voice speaks in response to a call, and that call is frequently a silent one. In response to the logoria of the Augustan age, with its explosion of print culture, its pamphlet wars, its dictionaries and encyclopedias, there's a new sense that space must be found to make room for poetic utterance. In the 4 poems I shall look at very briefly today, that space appears in the form of silence in a natural landscape. I should clarify that my approach differs from the usual reading of romantic poetry as a dialogue with nature, a channeling of natural inspiration, in quotes, or a discourse on the union of the mind with nature. Rather, I'm specifically interested in how silence calls these poems into being, and how the poems in turn shape the very idea of silence. By silence, I mean the cessation of speech and a relative suspension of sound. Yet that silence is not necessarily an absence. In some cases, it is most definitely a presence. While a number of writers in recent decades have theorized silence, including George Steiner and Susan Sontag, I find the work of Jean-Louis Chrétien, who died fairly young in 2019, to be most helpful in thinking of silence as an invitation to speech, what he calls in The Arc of Speech, the hospitality of listening. As he puts it elsewhere, in terms more apposite to the theme of this conference, the call creates the respondent. Chrétien focuses especially on prayer as a speech act, describing it as a self-manifestation before an invisible other and a radical self-exposure to alterity. His claim that through vocal prayer, an other silently enters my own dialogue with myself strikingly recalls the Romantic Ode and its companion genre, the conversation poem. I'm interested in how Chrétien's phenomenology of vocal prayer applies to poetry, especially these particular poems that dance around the edges of prayer, even as they claim a certain authority for the human poet. Coleridge's Frost at Midnight belongs to a genre of Coleridge's own invention called conversation poems, a confusing title because one party to the conversation is always silent. In this case, the silent human participant is Coleridge's infant son, Hartley. However, the silence of his cottage at midnight is what initially calls forth his words. "'Tis calm indeed, so calm that it disturbs and vexes meditation with its strange and extreme silentness." Part of the project of Coleridge and Wordsworth in the lyrical ballads and elsewhere is to excite a feeling analogous to the supernatural by awakening the mind's attention to the loveliness and the wonders of the world before us. That's a quotation from the Biographia Literaria. In this case, the silence or silentness is strange and extreme. It vexes meditation. Does that mean that it disrupts meditation, the usual sense of vex, or that it provokes it, stirring up his mind? G.S. Morris claims that, contrary to the usual Western conception, silence is not a boon to meditation, but an impediment, for silence represents a dearth of conversation, the absence of divine language or human encounter. Morris is keen to demonstrate that Coleridge's engagement with the divine word is not silent, though it often accompanies silence. He claims that the soot, the soul unquiet thing, becomes Coleridge's conversation partner, but then acknowledges that unquiet refers to movement, not to sound. After remembering his own idyllic, less than idyllic, I should say, childhood with its tedious school days, Coleridge is brought back to the present moment by his awareness of his infant son beside him. With his silent breathings heard in this deep calm, the child's breath fills up the pauses in the father's thought, not only supplying the nonverbal part of the conversation, but also practicing what Chrétien calls the hospitality of listening. We may split hairs as to whether Hartley's breathing constitutes silence. Indeed, as Morris notes, it is a sound that Coleridge seems not to hear until after his excursion into memory. Nonetheless, Hartley's presence calls forth the father's vision and invocation of a very different education for Hartley, a future that the poet speaks into being as a prophecy. "But thou, my babe, shalt wander like a breeze by lakes and sandy shores," and so on. "So shalt thou see and hear the lovely shapes and sounds intelligible of that eternal language which thy God utters, who from eternity doth teach himself in all and all things in himself. Great universal teacher, he shall mold thy spirit and by giving make it ask." It is telling and paradoxical that the climax of this vision is that giving will provoke asking rather than vice versa. To me, this is parallel to Chrétien's claim that we can only beckon to ourselves what has already turned itself toward us, already manifested itself to us, what calls upon us to call. The silent reflection represented in the poem's closing image of icicles quietly shining to the quiet moon beautifully captures this idea, especially since the moon itself shines only by way of reflection. If Frost at Midnight is quite literally an interior poem, Hymn Before Sunrise in the Vale of Chamonix is entirely out of doors. setting aside the awkward fact that Coleridge had not at that point visited Mont Blanc and was drawing much of the poem's imagery from Frederica Brun, the question of calling forth from silence forms a natural connection to Frost at Midnight and to Chrétien's thought. In particular, in the poem's first section, the silent mountain rising from the silent pines prompts a moment of contemplative prayer in which the mountain itself falls away, much as a repeated mantra drops out of consciousness. O dread and silent mount, I gazed upon thee, till thou, still present to my bodily sense, to the bodily sense, didst vanish from my thought. Entranced in prayer, I worshipped the invisible alone. The speaker, however, is not content with this passive prayer, this mute thanks and secret ecstasy. Only a vocal hymn will do. Arguably, it is the silence of the mountain that calls forth this hymn, in which he also enlists features of the landscape, heretofore silent as well. Thus, when he addresses his own soul and heart, he catalogs them alongside the green vales and icy cliffs. It is hard to determine whether the speaker's egocentrism is truly shattered in this experience, as it is the human poet who makes the landscape speak the name of God. Nonetheless, Coleridge seems aware that his voice is only mimicking the first voice that called forth all these elements into being, a voice he names with the question, who? In this, he demonstrates quite literally what he calls the primary imagination, which David Jasper cited in the plenary, a repetition in the finite mind of the eternal act of creation in the infinite I am. For all the bluster of the speaker as a choral conductor of the landscape, he recognizes what Chrétien notes as the radical disproportion of the response to the call. No response will ever correspond. The perfection of the answer will lie forever in its very deficiency, since what calls us in the call is from the start its very lack of measure, its incommensurability. Indeed, as Chrétien acknowledges, sometimes silence can be the only response. Hence Coleridge's rhetorical question, and who commanded? And the silence came. Here let the billows stiffen and have rest. For all his efforts to call forth sound from the landscape, Coleridge affirms that silence is not nothing. It is something created, in this case by divine fiat, just as it is created by the speaker's receptive attention in Frost at Midnight, as he listens to the breathing of his child, made manifest in turn by the mutual reflection between the moon and icicles. Shelley's Mont Blanc seems to respond directly to Coleridge's Hymn Before Sunrise, to the point of repeating some of its language. Shelley, however, who went around Switzerland signing guest books as atheist, pointedly avoids making the mountain speak of God. The closest he comes is when he says, "Thou hast a voice, great mountain, to repeal large codes of fraud and woe, not understood by all." It is difficult to tell whether Shelley himself claims to understand this voice. Unlike Coleridge, he does not presume to speak on behalf of the landscape or to make it speak. Rather, the poem seems preoccupied with the failure of speech, both the voices of the desert that fail and the very spirit that fails, driven like a homeless cloud, in imagery anticipating the Ode to the West Wind. Of course, Shelley is evoking the Burkean sublime, in which, quoting Burke, the mind is so entirely filled with its object that it cannot entertain any other, nor by consequence reason on that object which employs it. Shelley's homeless cloud recalls Burke's claim that the sublime hurries us on by an irresistible force. In West Wind, Shelley's speaker wishes to be lifted as a cloud on the wind, as a means of participating in the wind's power. In Mont Blanc, however, the distance between the speaker, observer, and the mountain becomes more definite as the poem proceeds. Richard Edelman sees Mont Blanc as a response not to the hymn, but to Coleridge's conversation poems, Frost at Midnight and the Aeolian Harp, which seem to offer insight into the secret workings of things and into the secret connections between mind and world. Shelley's poem, by contrast, casts doubt over the entire premise of Coleridge's poems, as it is only the human mind's imaginings that can bring knowledge out of the vacancy of the mountain's silence and solitude. Edelman describes Shelley's vision here as one of sustained and extended dizzying emptiness. While Edelman stops short of placing the poem in the tradition of the via negativa, I think that's exactly where it belongs. In contrast to the repeated echoes of God in Coleridge's hymn, Mont Blanc seems to affirm the view of pseudo-Dionysus in his mystical theology. Power dwells apart in its tranquility, remote, serene, and inaccessible. That's Shelley. Apart, that is, from our attempts to name it. The final section of Shelley's poem is full of negatives: moonless, voiceless, none, nor. And yet, in a final twist, Shelley claims that only the human mind keeps these sublime features of the material universe, the mountain, earth, and stars and sea, from vacancy. Or rather, he matches Coleridge's rhetorical question, who commanded, with another one. And what were thou and earth and stars and sea, if to the human mind's imaginings, silence and solitude were vacancy? To interpret this through a lens of Chrétien, what would become of the landscape, both the physical universe and the personified nature of romanticism, if poetry did not respond to the call of silence? Thus, we are back at the poem's beginning. The everlasting universe of things flows through the mind. But now the sense is less of the mind passively perceiving these things and more of silently affirming their being in response to an implacable and unknowable silence. It is tempting to identify this as what Francis de Sales calls the colloquy of silence. And yet, Shelley insists that the power dwells apart. It does not meet humanity, even in the silence. Thus, in a different way from Coleridge, Shelley imagines humanity having to supply both parts of the conversation. For Shelley, the silence that follows his closing question resembles what Chrétien calls an excessive silence, which illuminates speech and makes manifest instead of concealing. Indeed, the very device of a rhetorical question, if one does not rush to answer it, as Coleridge does, causes silence to give voice or to be a voice. The poem creates the silence at its own edges. As I conclude this paper, I'd like to turn briefly by way of contrast to Ode to the West Wind, where we see Shelley at his most vocative, or should I say invocative. It's a very noisy poem. While the wind cannot be seen except in its effects on land, in air, and on water, it is often heard. Shelley, however, seizes the microphone as though to say, you listen to me now. And what he commands to listen is breath itself, the very spirit that he calls upon to inspire his own words at the end of the poem. Although this poem seems much more cataphatic than apophatic, the bare trees of the forest become a kind of vacancy at the end of the poem, as music is made from the falling leaves and sparks from the speaker's dead thoughts. The poet imagines himself first as an aeolian harp and then as a trumpet for the wind to blow through, powerfully enacting Chrétien's claim that the call creates the respondent. The closing rhetorical question in this ode is perhaps its most quoted excerpt: if winter comes, can spring be far behind? It's often struck me as the weakest part of the poem, even more than the embarrassing bit about the thorns of life. But when I read it in the context of Mont Blanc and the Coleridge poems, I hear the rhetorical question differently. Both Coleridge and Shelley have difficulty letting the silence be silence. Coleridge concludes his hymn to sunrise with a command to tell the silent sky, earth with her 1,000 voices praises God. And yet in Frost at Midnight, his conversation with his sleeping son ends by yielding to another silent conversation, the exchange of light between the icicles and the moon. Shelley's poems discussed here both end with a what-if question addressed to some powerful other. The falling silent at the end allows the silence, in effect, to answer the question. The invitation, the hospitality of listening has been extended, and the poet has acknowledged that despite his atheistic commitments, he does not and cannot speak alone. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jennifer, also Daniel. And Jennifer for sharing silently something about silence, in fact. I will share my screen, hope to keep the 15 minutes limit. Please, here. Okay. Can you see it well, please? I'm trying to share. Yep, thank you. So I would like to focus on the works of Milan Rufus, who was a Slovak poet. He wrote some prosaic work, which is more essays kind of formed. But when you read it, it's very poetic as well. So he was quite a poet, actually. The original title was to focus on poets as messengers of God, but I've actually added a little question underneath if it means religious poets or poets belonging to any religion, in fact. Rufus, well, I don't know if you've heard of him, so this is just a very brief thing about his life. He explicitly mentions that poets are messengers of God. So it's not something I would like to prove. What I would like to do is to unravel what he meant. Why are they prophets or messengers of God, as he names it? First, I would like to start with his understanding of who prophets are. And except messengers of God, you see a little quote from his poem. By the way, when it's in italics in the presentation, it means I'm quoting him, just to make sure. So obviously the God he's talking about is not some metaphysical, somewhere, I don't know, residing creature or transcendent creature, I don't know. But it's God is someone who is present on the earth in some ways. And I will speak later about how. He calls prophets, now the biblical prophets of the Old Testament, of course, as the first poets because he enjoys the images. And actually he says that the Bible is quite a work of art because of that. So he finds a lot of inspiration from this tradition that he's somehow appropriating in his own work. What prophets were typical for, and this is something that he also identifies with poets, is that they're always in conflict with themselves, with the world, with the society, with God even, and they wrestle with all of that somehow. So the burden of being a prophet is quite a tough one. Yeah? It's a fate that one has to, it's not a blessing in a way, but it's at the same time quite a burden. Regarding poets, the first line is a quote. He calls them God's messengers and the heart of God's bell, nicely put. And these poets as prophets are installed. Already Daniel mentioned calling, so they are literally called. And when you read those passages from his poems about that, describing his own calling, it's like reading about the calling of the prophet Jeremiah, I believe. It's very, very down to earth, very, very graphic in a way, how a person is captivated by God to become a poet. But so it becomes a fate, something one cannot in a way avoid. You cannot run away from it as Jonah from Nineveh or something like that. You have to carry it somehow. What poets do is they contemplate. Interestingly enough, and that's how they write, that's how they create, by contemplation. But he doesn't understand contemplation as some kind of meditative, relaxed, I don't know, or concentrated on the other way kind of state, but something done through the whole life of the poet. He even says that the whole organism of the poet is actually doing the contemplation. So being fully immersed in life is the only way to really do poetry, in his view. What poets do not receive is revelation. It's not that they would be somehow specially enlightened or so to say something and just find a way how to do it, but they appropriate tradition. So they, again, is this wrestling mode. They wrestle with the tradition, meaning the contemporary world, the challenges of the world, but also the tradition, literary, and in his view, also the biblical one. So the question is, what message are these messengers conveying? Is it a message from above, or what is it? And in his works, I distinguish two main callings, or the content of the calling of a prophet in his works. One is the truth. They're supposed to tell the truth. What he means with the truth, he does not really say. Sometimes he writes it with a capital T, but basically says it's a witness to reality. So it's telling, it's here of the way of the telling things as they are, pardon me. So it's not necessarily giving huge answers, but asking the questions, trying to shed light on how things are in the present world. And there is the quote, a poet tells the truth, he does not create it. A poet is creative in a different way, not how things are. And this is possible only, this truth telling, only because the poet is immersed in the world. It's not someone who is looking at the world as if from above, from some tower, having a great overview, not being immersed in life, but just the other way around. The poet has to be completely, well, living, so to speak. The second thing a poet is called to talk about is human mystery. Rufus, yeah, there are some quotes you can read. He says, we are all human, yet at the same time, it's mysterious. What does it mean to be human? And he is pointing to, he's given us several hints of what he means, specifically focusing, there is one poem that is reflecting what he calls there is not a good English word, a kind of a destiny or a fate embodied in Jesus. And what he means is this tension that every human being has to live with, being what he calls an animal and a spirit. And Jesus was the one who, in his view, was able to balance both. Rufus doesn't want anybody to as if avoid life, but at the same time to be in life and neglect the kind of spiritual part that he would probably name it this way, would not be living up to the mystery of being human. So, of course, in the tradition of Judeo-Christian tradition, he understands that people, or he believes that people are created in the image of God. And poetry is something that is supposed to help decipher that reality, as if. So not only this tension between animal and spirit within themselves, so leading people to self-reflection, which I quote there in one of his poems, is actually called The Seventh Day, even the poem. And he doesn't necessarily mean a Sunday, but he means a day where one is alone. And in that state, one can touch what he calls the depth, or something, not necessarily the spirit that he names, but the depth in which it is possible to encounter the divine. So this depth, I think all the other authors talk about it a lot, that it's a kind of the blind spot or the void that one is trying to fill with other things, but it's there, you're probably familiar with it. I put a little note on dragon there because he makes a parallel, he uses the dragon mythology or dragons from fairy tales he says that this need to pay attention to this void is like a dragon who comes regularly, and you have to pay attention to him. You cannot put it away. So for him, it's so urgent or so unavoidable in a way that this need that a person has in them is coming over and over again. And poetry, or the role of poet, is in fact to lead people to this kind of self-reflection, at the same time to draw their attention outside to the world. Oh, sorry, it's here. Which he names as freedom. I will come back to the earlier slides. In his understanding of what does it mean to be human, meditating on this human mystery is as if meditating on who human beings are. And he has different concepts that he uses interchangeably. And we see quite a journey through his works to a better formulation or explanation, I would say, of these terms, human wisdom and wise humanness, that sort of give the answer or try to give the answer to the question of not only who we are, but how we can live, how we can be fully immersed in life. And for that, he uses these two terms, wise humaneness and human wisdom. The core of how to live for him is to try to find, again, a balance between what he calls, that should be a quote actually, when humility and when defiance. Against the story of Jesus for him is quite an example of that he was able to find the balance. He wasn't submissive when he wasn't supposed, wasn't supposed to be, but he was quite defiant when necessary. Important is that when he talks about this human wisdom, wise humaneness, he emphasizes that it is not a gift. It is always a challenge. It is something that people can create. And he distinguishes, I believe, at least that's what I've sort of seen in his writings, these three dimensions of this wise humaneness as the good, freedom, and love. Again, the word defiance is repeated there, as you see. He's very clear. And I think this is the point where he's trying to make the distinction between a gift and an effort. That a gift for him, it seems, would mean that we don't have to do much anymore. We just sort of go with it. We use the gift. But with this notion or importance of defiance, he's trying to make the point, it's your job, you have to try. And again, there is the notion, the importance of the struggle that human beings have to do to be human. And at the same time, the struggle of the prophet to live out the same. The prophet is not exempt from the challenges. Now, I have this little slide here because it's interesting that when Rufus talks about the challenges of calling, of what the messengers of God are supposed to convey, he says that the same core elements that I have mentioned actually are present in fairy tales. He means folk fairy tales. This is a picture of his daughter and his wife, and a list of, just so that you see how much he wrote for children. It's quite interesting. But this is a list of quotes. I picked some of them that he actually writes, I would say, in praise of fairy tales. It's interesting that he does not say that the beautiful imagery or telling the truth, the things as they are, he does not say that maybe sermons, would have that, or I don't know, lofty books or something, but a tradition of centuries, as he says, that was able to capture the important, content of the calling of the prophets. He doesn't talk about the struggle that actually the prophecy, being the messenger of God, brings with it, but he repeats the notion of goodness that is there, truth, and what does it mean to be human? That there are examples of the right amount of humility and defiance that are found there, and of course the never-ending struggle between good and evil. Hopla. So this is just a sort of I put here some, maybe a summary kind of what a poem or poetry is supposed to do. I very much like the notion of an alliance of truth and beauty that is supposed to be messaged by the poets, prophets in this sense. But what is important for Rufus is that whatever the messenger of God is putting out there, he encourages the readers to interpret it. He sort of avoided, he didn't really want to interpret his own poems. He said this is up to those who actually receive the message. And it's really, and he encouraged it, say what it's meaning to you, whoever is encountering it. So just to sum up, poets as messengers of God are telling the truth about reality, not religious truth, not revealed truth, but what they perceive as the true truth of human condition, point to the mystery of what does it mean to be human. So I would say that they are mediating transcendence, hopefully to be met with the transcendent one in human depth, and mediate the touch with reality and motivate people to change it with their freedom. And I would say to the little question I would put at the beginning, that this seems to be not a necessary religious task, as being human is really interhuman undertaking and not necessarily a religious one. Thank you very much.
So, questions?
Can I put a question to Daniel? And thank you to all three presenters. Terrific presentations there. Daniel, just a thing that's always intrigued me about Blake, and you mentioned the kind of prophetic call and the call to vocational responsibility at precisely a time where he had to tone things down because of the getting embroiled with the civil authorities and the civil case that was brought against him in the early 19th century there. And the possibility or the idea that this was in some ways seen as a kind of betrayal of his revolutionary or prophetic instincts, that he had to deny his radical sympathies and so on. Do you have a take on all of that as to where that fits into to his writings and thinking?
I'm not sure I do. I know people that read Blake more as a political figure than a religious one tends to suggest that some of the later books are kind of sublimated political agitation, and that the true meaning in Blake is always more political than theological, as it were. I don't know how much there is to that. It seems to me that the trajectory of Blake's vision and his work is fairly consistent. And even though he has to tone down perhaps some of the politics, I think gradually he works through politics towards envisioning a more transformative, the changes that he wants to see in humans and in the world are not limited to the political sphere. And I think he fairly consistently kind of digs deeper and expands his vision, I think. And I think there is enough politics in Milton and in Jerusalem. I think there are some really prescient critiques of industrialism and so on, for example, and injustice.
I was thinking specifically of the trial, the sedition trial that he found himself in when he was accused of being disrespectful to the king or whatever, and the fact that he had to kind of, oh no, not me, Squire.
Yeah.
But I mean, we can follow that up maybe again on another occasion.
I'm not sure how much an effect it had on his way of working. I don't know.
Yeah,
It clearly shocked him.
yeah, yeah. And a fascinating open discussion to be had around that.
Yeah.
But thank you again. Yeah.
Yes.
I have a quick question for Michaela. I didn't know Milan Rufus, so thanks a lot for introducing him. Did he write only poetry, or he wrote also essays? Your quotations are from his poetry, or
Both. He, especially the notion of wise humaneness or wise humanity, is from his essays, even though it's first mentioned, for what I have found, so I hope I'm right, in one of the in the poem on he simply calls it A Man, which is the poem on Jesus and how he took up he was able to deal with fate. So I think there he uses the term for the first time. So I used both. I used all I could have found.
And the translations that you quoted are your own, or?
Most of them, yes. There are some translations into English I have found. Ironically, because he was translating himself poetry from those 4 languages, which is astonishing. But I found some into English, but I'm not sure how good they are. Personally, I don't know. I'm not a professional translator, but there are some to be found. Collections. Yeah.
If I may, I don't know whether I am heard.
Yes, we can hear you.
Well, very quick question. Thank you very much. Very interesting poet and very interesting talk. But I would like to address your last concluding statement that he sees poets as messengers of God, and if they are messengers of God, they tell the truth about reality. And I wonder, of course, we know that there are also false prophets who do not tell the truth. And I wonder whether in his poetry he takes into account, into consideration, the fact that there may be false prophets as well. Thank you. I don't know whether we will have time to answer this question because there's only 1 minute left, but maybe, and if not, later.
Yes, thank you very much. Yes, he talks about false prophets. Of course, what I maybe should have added, but thank you for the question because I have a chance to say it. Not every prophet is a God's messenger. Not every poet will be a God's messenger in his way of seeing things, of course. For him, he distinguishes between what he calls, now how to translate it, kind of not laborers, something like people who just know how to do it, as if the skill, but lack the
Craftsmen,
yes,
as opposed to visionaries, perhaps.
He wouldn't talk about visionaries. No, he really believes that it is important to describe reality as it is. But what I would say that he was not a postmodernist, but he was rather a modernist in the sense that he believed that truth is something, if you want it, you can see it, I would say, if you really try. So he was, and you mean it, and yeah. But false prophets were something that even